Taken by the Lycan King, written by Short Story Queen. Chapter 1. The Bargain. It was raining the night her fate was sold. Not the kind of gentle rain that softened the ground or coaxed warmth from the earth, but a hard, cold curtain of water that made the world feel small and gray. The manor house, built of black stone and bone-earned pride, stood rigid against the storm, its fires burning high and red in the windows, like watching eyes. Inside, the fire crackled, but the warmth did not reach her. Varya stood in the shadows behind the tapestry-lined wall, breath quiet and limbs still, trained like a ghost to observe without being seen. She had known to follow her father when he summoned the visiting Alpha into his study. She had learned long ago that things done in whispers and behind locked doors were the things that determined her life. Tonight would be no exception. The heavy scent of bloodroot whiskey and wet fur filled the air beyond the stone archway, where her father's voice curled like smoke. Low, deliberate, sharpened with satisfaction. He was not drunk. He never was when he bartered power. "You'll have her before the next moonrise," he said, the words spoken as if he were discussing cattle, not flesh. Obedient, untouched, and more clever than she pretends to be. Alpha Malric chuckled, a sound that slid like oil over stone. "You guarantee she won't fight back?" "She wouldn't dare." Jorundral's voice darkened, amused and contemptuous. "She knows better. She's been trained to kneel." Varya swallowed, her fingers curled into the folds of her cloak. That was a lie, at least in part. She had been trained to appear obedient, yes, but never broken. Never truly his. There were things in her that even he did not know, things she had buried deep enough to survive. The men went on, voices rumbling like thunder, negotiating her price in land, allegiance, and flesh. Malric wanted a wife. Jorun wanted to rise again, to claw back what he lost after the failed uprising. Varya had been his final pawn, and now her moment had come. He was giving her away. No ceremony, no say, just a trade, wolf to wolf. She turned from the wall then, not because she couldn't bear to listen, but because something inside her had shifted. Not fear. She was well acquainted with that, but a kind of bone-deep finality. It had always been leading to this. Girls like her, daughters of failed alphas, existed to serve as payment for ambition. She would be gone by morning, but fate, as it happened, was not so easily sold. The attack came not with howls, but with silence. One moment the guards at the gate were drinking under the storm. The next their bodies were motionless in the mud. No warning, no sound, just the smell of raw blood rising into the rain-soaked air. By the time Varya reached the upper landing of the Great Hall, pulled from her half-sleep by some instinct she did not yet understand, the manor doors had already been torn from their hinges. She saw her father standing firm, flanked by what remained of his household guard, eyes burning with the fury of a man who had just realized he was no longer in control. At the center of the room stood a figure like iron in the shape of a man. He didn't shout, he didn't roar, he didn't need to. The Lycan King was taller than she expected, broader too, his presence not loud but dense, like a storm cloud that had already swallowed half the sky. He was dressed in black, not armor, and yet no blade touched him. He moved with a predator's certainty, each step silent, final, inevitable. His eyes were the color of old silver, no gleam, no warmth, and when they passed over the room, they stripped it bare. He said only one thing before the killing began. "This is your reckoning." What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. Jorun's men fell swiftly, some without ever shifting. Varya did not scream. She didn't run. She stood still as stone on the upper floor, her eyes locked to the king's even when the blood splattered high against the walls, even when the great hall was left in ruin, even when her father, breathing hard, bleeding but not yet fallen, raised his voice to curse the Lycan throne. The king did not look at him. Instead, his gaze slid up slowly, precisely, until it met Varya's. In that instant, something cold and ancient crawled beneath her skin. Not fear, not dread, something worse, something inevitable. The moment his eyes met hers, the space between them collapsed. She felt it, not in her chest, but in her blood, a flare of heat, a sense of being pulled. Something wild and wordless stirred at the edge of her consciousness, scratching behind her ribs like a creature waking in the dark. The king moved again, not toward her father, not toward the carnage behind him, but toward the stairs. "No," Joran rasped. "You'll take my head if you must, but not my blood." The king raised his hand and Joran stopped mid-step. Not from fear, from pain. Something unseen held him rooted in place, his breath choked off in a silent gasp. "I take what belongs to me," the king said. Then, without effort, without ceremony, without asking her name, he reached the top of the stairs and closed his hand around her arm. His grip was firm, warm despite the cold, and impossibly steady. She could have screamed. She could have struggled. She did neither, because something new, in her bones, in the dark pulse of her awakening wolf, that this man was no stranger. He was not a captor. He was not salvation. He was her ruin, and she was already his. No words were spoken as he led her out into the rain. No declarations, no warnings, just the wind and the weight of inevitability. Behind them, Joran's voice broke once more, fury burning into the storm. But the king did not turn back, and he had what he came for. And the girl, silent beside him, did not know yet what had begun. But she felt it burning behind her ribs, where something wild was stirring. The king would not break her, but neither would she escape him. Not now, not ever. Chapter 2. His mercy is cold. The journey to the Lycan King's stronghold was not a blur. It was not mercifully forgettable. It carved itself into Varya's memory with every passing mile like a wound that refused to clot. The rain never ceased. It followed them through the black forest like a second skin, soaking into the folds of her cloak, running down her neck in cold trickles, pooling inside her boots. She did not ask where they were going. She did not ask why he had taken her. Questions felt useless in the presence of a man who commanded silence simply by existing. Kyle Varen, the Lycan King, did not look at her once. He rode ahead of her, not beside her, his horse dark as midnight and equally wordless. The guards who flanked them were Lycans too, stone-faced and sharp-eyed, their scent heavier than anything she had ever known. There was power in the way they moved, something precise and slow, like predators that never needed to rush. And then there was the feeling. It started as a heat low in her spine. Not constant, not warm, but flickering, like a signal from something inside her that had not known how to speak until now. Every time Cale shifted his weight in the saddle, every time his eyes lifted briefly to scan the tree line, the heat throbbed, faint, then sharper, then gone again, as though her wolf, dormant for so long, was beginning to stir in his presence. She did not understand it. She only knew it was his nearness that drew it out. They did not stop to rest. Food was passed to her without words. She took it with hands that were growing clumsy from cold. No one offered her a blanket. She did not ask for one. To appear weak, even now, felt like defeat. By the time the mountain appeared, jagged and black against the blood-washed sky, her legs ached from the saddle, and her lips had gone numb. Cale did not announce their arrival. He simply turned his horse toward the cliff path, and the others followed without sound. The fortress revealed itself slowly, carved into the side of the mountain like a secret, its stone dark as obsidian and twice as unforgiving. There were no banners, no signs of celebration or triumph, only the cold echo of hooves on the stone bridge and the press of ancient power in the air. She did not expect the gate to open, but it did soundlessly, as if called by his presence alone. Inside, the walls were high and cruelly smooth. The corridor they led her through was lit by narrow torches, their flames pale blue, casting everything in a strange, cold glow. Her boots tracked mud over polished stone. No one said a word. He did not take her to a throne room. There was no ceremony, no judgment, only silence, as she was led up a narrow staircase, through a vaulted hall, and into a room she would later come to know too well. It was large, bare, not unkind but unwelcoming. The walls were stone, darker even than the ones below, and the hearth at the far end was unlit. There was a bath emptied, a bed massive, and a single window, arched and high, where the last of the storm painted streaks down the glass. Kyle entered last. He stood by the door as the guards withdrew, their footfalls swallowed by the stone, and did not speak until the room had settled. "You will stay here," he said simply. "You are not to leave without permission." Varya did not answer, not out of defiance, but because her voice, when she searched for it, had vanished somewhere in the cold. He didn't seem to care, and without another word he turned and left her alone, the heavy door sealing shut behind him with a sound that echoed like a blade being driven into the earth. And still her wolf pulsed. She did not shift, she hadn't since childhood, but the weight of that presence inside her had changed. It wasn't words, not yet. Just sensation, a silent watchfulness. She crossed to the window, looked out. The world beyond the glass was endless stone and jagged cliffs broken by flashes of lightning in the distance. Below, a winding path disappeared into the mist. There would be no running from this place, no escape into the trees. She had been taken far beyond the reaches of her father's kingdom. She was not a guest here, she was not a prisoner either. She was something else and something unnamed. Later, a servant arrived, a girl no older than Varya herself, with quiet eyes and hands that moved as if memorizing every object they touched. She filled the bath, laid out robes, brought bread and broth without comment. Varya did not speak to her. When the door closed again, Varya peeled off her soaked clothes and stepped into the bath. The water burned at first. Then it soothed. Then it numbed. She sank low until only her face remained above the surface, the heat leaching the cold from her bones, but not the tension, not the awareness. He had touched her arm. Only once. Only briefly. But she could still feel the imprint of his hand. Not bruised, not rough, just final. She had not been asked. She had not been offered. She had simply been taken, and somewhere in the echo of her own blood something responded. Not in fear, in recognition. That night she did not sleep in the bed. She curled in the corner by the window, wrapped in the thick robe, and watched the lightning crawl across the sky like the fingers of some forgotten god. She did not cry. She did not speak. But she listened. To the wind, to the stone, to the quiet throb of something ancient shifting inside her. The king had not harmed her, but his mercy was not gentle, it was cold, absolute, like the mountain itself. And she knew with the certainty of instinct that nothing he had done so far had been out of kindness. He had taken her for a reason, and soon he would reveal what it was. Chapter 3. A Cage of Stone and Ice. Morning did not come with sunlight. It crept through the high window like an apology, gray, thin, unwilling. In the mountain stronghold of the Lycan King, dawn was not something to be welcomed. It arrived only because the darkness permitted it. Varya had not moved from her corner. The fire in the hearth had burned low in the night, casting long, skeletal shadows across the stone. Her body ached from the way she had curled, muscles stiff beneath the thick robe, but she did not rise. She watched the pale light creep up the wall like frost, the silence around her so deep it almost felt like a second skin. She didn't feel like herself. Not quite. Her thoughts were clear, but her body felt shifted, as though something inside her had begun to change shape, stretching in silence beneath her ribs. Not her wolf. Not fully, but the edge of it. Like something that had been dormant too long had smelled something ancient and started to stir. She pressed her fingers against the hollow of her throat, half expecting to feel heat there. There was none. Only skin. Only breath. Still she felt watched. It wasn't the kind of gaze that could be traced to a door or a window. It was weightless but pressing, a knowing that lived beneath the surface. The fortress itself seemed to hum with it, as though the very walls remembered who had brought her here. The robe still smelled faintly of lavender and ash, scents too soft for a place this unforgiving. Eventually she rose. Her limbs fought her stiff with cold and stillness, but she stood, crossed the stone floor without sound, touched the edge of the heavy door, not to open it, but simply to feel it. Solid, unmoving, final. She had not tried to leave, not because she believed she couldn't, but because something in her already knew what would happen if she did. Not punishment, not violence, just inevitability. The Lycan King had not taken her to lock her in a cage. No. He had brought her here because he knew she would not run. And that somehow was worse. There were no windows in the corridor outside, only torches that burned low and blue, casting an otherworldly light across stone walls worn smooth with time. When she stepped out, no one stopped her. No guards, no eyes. Only the sound of her bare feet on cold stone and the faint whisper of her own breath. She walked slowly, letting instinct guide her. The hallways turned in strange, precise angles, as though the fortress had not been built, but grown, like the mountain had carved itself into walls and staircases out of loyalty to the one who ruled it. She found the library by accident. It was tucked behind an unmarked archway half swallowed by shadows, the door left slightly ajar. She would not have noticed it if she hadn't paused there, drawn by the faint scent of old paper and something older still. Dust, ink, time. Inside, the air felt heavier. Not suffocating, but sacred. The kind of stillness that demanded silence. Towering shelves of dark wood reached toward the vaulted ceiling, packed with tomes bound in leather and bone, their spines marked in runes she only half recognized. She stepped through them like she was walking through memories. Her fingers hovered near the books, but did not touch. Touching felt like trespass. There was a reading table at the center of the room, long and bare, a single oil lamp flickering at its center. No warmth, only light. Someone had been here not long ago. The lamp was too new, the scent of it still clinging to the air. But she saw no one. She lingered anyway. Something about the room felt alive in a way the rest of the fortress did not. There was no pretense of hospitality here, no attempt at comfort, but the silence was different, not empty, not watchful. Listening. She let herself breathe. Her fingers finally brushed a spine. The book was untitled, the leather cracked, the binding worn. She pulled it free with care, dust curling in the low light, and carried it to the table. The pages inside were dense, the script narrow and precise, filled with diagrams and annotations in ink that had long since faded to brown. It wasn't written in the common tongue, but she could read it. Slowly. She had been taught in secret long ago by a woman her father had executed for knowing too much. Reading had become a kind of defiance after that, a quiet rebellion hidden behind silence and lowered eyes. The book spoke of bloodlines, of the High Luna, a lineage nearly forgotten, of bonds formed not by choice but by threads spun before birth. Her breath stilled. There, drawn in careful lines, was the ancient symbol of the fated. Two wolves mirrored, not in battle, but in surrender. A mark said to burn only when the soul recognized its other half. Rare, sacred, dangerous. She stared at the page until her vision blurred. The Lycan King had not spoken of the bond, he had not acknowledged it. But she had felt it, deep in her bones, like something buried clawing toward the surface. He knew. And he had said nothing. The door behind her opened, soundless. She did not turn. She did not need to. The weight in the air shifted like gravity bending toward a star. Kale. He did not speak. His silence was not absence. It was presence, so thick it filled the room to the edges. She could feel him behind her, not close but near enough, that the air felt denser with every breath. Her fingers stayed on the page. She did not look back. Still, the heat beneath her skin sparked. Not desire, not yet, but recognition. That same unbearable awareness. like her body remembered something her mind had not yet accepted. He crossed the room, quiet as a shadow. When he passed her, she felt the edge of his presence slide along her like frost. He took a book from the opposite shelf, said nothing, sat down at the other end of the table. For a time, there was only the sound of pages turning. No conversation, no orders. Just the unbearable silence of two creatures bound by something neither of them had chosen. When she finally left, the weight of his gaze followed her. Not possessive, not cruel, just aware. As if now that he had found her, he could no longer unsee her. And she, for the first time, did not want to be unseen. Chapter 4. The mate bond flickers. The snow came in silence. Varya woke to it dusting the high window in soft, pale layers, the light outside diffused and white, as though the world beyond the fortress had ceased its violence just long enough to dress itself in quiet. She did not know how many days had passed. Time did not move here as it did elsewhere. The fortress obeyed a rhythm of its own, cold, still, deliberate. No bells marked the hours. No servants stirred her. No footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond her door. She had stopped waiting for structure. She moved when her body told her to, slept when her mind collapsed from fatigue, and wandered the stone halls with her silence for company. It had become a strange kind of freedom, not freedom in the traditional sense. She was still confined, still watched, still very much taken. But no one struck her. No one barked commands. The king left her alone and yet never truly absent. His presence seemed to live in the walls themselves. Subtle, heavy, always near. It was in the way the guards' eyes flicked downward when they passed her, in the way servants paused when she entered a room, as if unsure whether to bow, in the way her path through the fortress was never blocked but never quite open. She was not a prisoner, she was not a guest, and she was his and yet still unclaimed. That truth hung over her like frost on the edge of her spine. She had begun to feel it more clearly now. The bond. It was not loud. It did not roar or burn or beg. It simply existed, like a second heartbeat just beneath her own. And whenever he came near, it grew stronger. The first time it truly pulled, she was in the northern hall, walking along a curved corridor where the mountain wall exposed raw stone veined with ice. She had stopped, fingers brushing the cold mineral, when a breath of heat touched the back of her neck. She turned. He was there, not close, not watching, simply passing. He didn't acknowledge her. His expression did not change, but her body did. Her spine straightened. Her lungs forgot how to fill. A strange ache bloomed just below her ribs, not pain, not fear, but something more primal. And her wolf stirred, and it was clearer now. Not a voice, not yet, but a whisper under her skin. A weight behind her eyes. A presence that felt both hers and not. As if it had been sleeping too long and now refused to go unnoticed. Kyle passed without a word. Without pause. But her fingers, still against the stone, trembled once as he vanished down the corridor. She knew what it was. She had read it in the books he left out for her in the library. Books with no titles, no authors. Only carefully preserved legends of bonds forged not by blood, but by fate. The ancient rite of the mate mark. The invisible pull between two wolves born under the same thread of moonlight. It was not love, not safety, not comfort, and it was instinct. The first time she saw his hands, truly saw them. They were bare, unadorned, strong, marked with faint scars that looked like slashes from battles long buried. She had not expected them to be elegant. They were. He was standing by the edge of the great hearth in the gathering hall. Firelight licked across his skin, casting him in shadows too precise to be accidental. He wore no crown, no armor, no symbol of power. He didn't need any. The room was empty but for them. He was not looking at her. Still, the bond pulled. Her wolf pushed forward suddenly, hot and sharp behind her eyes. It wasn't a command. It was a craving, not for touch, not for possession, but for proximity, for closeness, for something old. She breathed once, slow and full, and it steadied. She did not let it show. But something in her shifted that day, as though her body had accepted a truth her mind still refused to speak aloud. The king's silence had never felt like indifference, it was restraint. And now she understood why. He knew. He had known from the moment his hand closed around her arm in the great hall. He had felt the bond, the flicker, the undeniable hum of fate laced through flesh and instinct. He had recognized it, and he had chosen not to act. That choice unsettled her more than any threat ever could, because it meant he could take her, mark her, claim her, make her his with a single bite. And yet he hadn't. Not because he respected her, because he was waiting. She didn't know for what, for her to break, for her to beg, or for something inside himself to settle. That night she returned to her room and found the fire already lit. The robe laid out for her was thicker than the last, lined with fur, soft at the collar. Beside it, a folded piece of parchment, unsealed. No signature, no crest, only 2 words written in a precise, sharp hand. Dress tonight. She stared at the note until the fire cracked behind her. Not a request, not a demand, just an expectation. Her fingers did not shake as she picked up the robe, but her pulse, steady for days, began to shift again. Not with fear, with anticipation. Chapter 5. She won't bow. The robe fit like it had been measured in silence. It was dark, almost black, with a subtle sheen that caught the firelight in shifting glimmers of slate and ash. No embroidery, no decoration, no lace. Just clean, regal lines, and a collar that brushed against her collarbone like the ghost of a hand. Varya fastened it without ceremony. There were no maids to assist her, no soft voices to murmur reassurances or powder her throat. She dressed alone in the quiet, beneath the weight of the king's note. She did not ask where she was going. She had learned now that this fortress gave no answers. It simply waited for obedience. She did not intend to give it. The corridor beyond her door had changed. Not in shape, but in atmosphere. Torches burned higher now. The air smelled sharper. Pine, winter. Something faintly spiced. She moved with care, her footsteps echoing softer than usual, drawn not by command but by instinct, down the long hall, and through a narrow set of double doors that had been closed every day before this one. The room beyond was not large. It was circular, with stone walls that sloped upward into a pointed dome painted black with constellations she did not recognize. No throne, no guards, no wolves. Only a single long table made of something dark and ancient, surrounded by figures already seated, their eyes rising as she entered. They were not strangers. She had seen some of them in passing, Kale's advisors, warriors, high-ranked Lycans whose names she had not been given. Their attention now was not polite. It was not cold either. It was evaluating. At the end of the table stood Kyle. He was not dressed like a king tonight. No cloak, no leather. Just a black shirt rolled to his elbows and trousers tucked into worn boots. He looked almost unremarkable like that, save for the way the room bent around his presence. It wasn't about posture or expression. It was something deeper. Gravity. She did not stop at the threshold. She did not lower her head. She stepped forward slowly, one hand resting lightly at her side, the other trailing the edge of her robe. Not nervously, but with measured calm, like she had practiced walking into rooms she was not invited to her whole life. Kale's eyes did not move from her. He did not speak, but a chair was waiting, empty, deliberately placed to his right, not across from him like an adversary, not beside him like a partner, somewhere between the two. She paused behind it. She could feel the shape of the moment. What they were waiting for. What he was testing. A silent ritual as old as Wolfkind. Sit, accept, submit. It would be subtle. The others might not even notice it. But Kale would. She did not sit. Not yet. Her fingers brushed the back of the chair once. Then she turned, not away, not in retreat, but deliberately, and let her gaze travel slowly across the room, landing on each pair of eyes without flinching. None of them challenged her, and so she stood, not defiant, not disrespectful, but still refusing to bow. The silence grew heavier. Cal did not move, did not gesture. He only watched her, and in the long beat that followed, something ancient passed between them, not in words, but in weight. He had taken her, brought her here, set the stage, and still she would not kneel. The bond between them stirred like a breath between clenched teeth. It was warmer now, closer to the surface, a tether neither of them pulled but both could feel. She wondered if the others sensed it too. The slow, steady burn of it pressing against the room's cold. Cale's gaze narrowed, not in anger, in assessment. Then without warning he turned and sat. No announcement, no scolding, no test. He simply let the moment end. The others resumed their positions, the low murmurs of politics rising again. Territories, allegiances, quiet reports from the outer packs. Varya stood for a long time before taking the seat at last, careful not to shift her weight like a servant or a subordinate. She listened, she memorized, and Cale did not speak to her. Not once, but she felt his attention like a thread of heat running beneath the table, steady, exact, unnervingly still. When the meeting ended, the others filed out with murmured nods and careful glances. No one spoke to her directly. Not yet. She was still an uncertainty, still an unknown variable in a world that valued control over curiosity. Cale rose last. She waited for him to leave first, but he didn't. He lingered by the far archway, one hand braced lightly on the stone, his profile etched in firelight, carved sharp by shadow. He said nothing. He did not look back. But she knew what it meant. He had expected her to fold. Instead, she had shown teeth, and now the game had changed. Chapter 6. The Smell of Rain. The fortress had grown colder, though no storm had come. Varya felt it not in the stones or in the air, but in the way the corridors pressed against her shoulders as she walked them. Narrower somehow, though unchanged. Even the firelight seemed to burn lower. The shadows grew longer behind her. Nothing reached for her, but everything watched. She had not seen Kyle in 2 days. His absence wasn't silent, it was pointed, like a thread pulled taut across the distance between them. Unspoken, unresolved, but unmistakably felt. The bond did not go dormant in his absence. It simmered, quiet, patient, alive, beneath her skin. And still, she refused to name it. She did not pace or wait. Instead, she wandered the far side of the fortress, the less tended halls, the silent stairwells carved into the belly of the mountain, the places the guards did not go and the servants did not speak of. She walked like a ghost might, careful and slow, pressing her palm against stone every few steps to stay tethered to something real. The further she went, the more the air changed, cleaner, sharper, as if the cold down there had never been touched by firelight at all. That was where she found it. The old door was warped with time, tucked between 2 broken sconces and marked with a faint crest she did not recognize. A single line drawn in a circle, surrounded by 6 teeth. It gave when she pushed, reluctant but not locked. The scent met her first, not dust, not rot. Something older. The crisp scent of pine, damp earth, rain not yet fallen. She stepped inside. The chamber beyond was small and round, lined with cracked shelves and stone alcoves filled with bundles of dried herbs, bones strung with faded thread, and old scrolls bound in leather straps. A forgotten apothecary, or something like it. But that wasn't what stilled her breath. Near the far wall, hunched beneath a sagging arch, someone stood, back bent, hands deep in a bowl of what looked like powdered bark. An old woman, skin the color of driftwood, hair coiled in thick gray braids wrapped tight around her crown. She did not startle. She did not turn. She had heard Varya enter long before the door creaked open. "So," the woman said, voice like flint dragged across silk, "the girl finally finds her way down." Varya stepped forward, quiet but without hesitation. The woman did not glance up. Her fingers continued working the mixture in her bowl, movements efficient and almost reverent. "You know who I am," Varya said. Not a question, but not quite a claim either. The woman let out a sound that might have been a laugh. "You wear the bond on your skin like a fever," she said. "Anyone with half a wolf in them can feel you coming." Varya's throat tightened, but she didn't answer. The woman turned then slowly, her eyes small but clear, the whites veined with gold. A rare mark, one Varya had only read about in old texts. Seers, bloodkeepers, wolves with memory longer than most. "You knew my mother," Varya said softly. A pause, then a nod. "I held her hand when you were born," the woman said. "Your father locked me away before her body cooled." The words landed with no ceremony, no accusation, just fact. Varya stepped deeper into the room. There were no chairs, no warmth. Only the scent of pine and sage and something bitter that burned faintly at the back of her throat. "What was her name?" she asked after a silence. "She had 3, the woman said. "But she gave you only one. Varya, it means to guard, to resist, not the name your father wanted." She moved to a shelf, pulled free a jar sealed with wax, and set it down with a soft clink. "I remember her eyes," the woman murmured. "Not the color, the weight. She looked like someone who had seen the truth and decided to love it anyway." Varya said nothing. There were no memories for her to summon, no lullabies, no gentle hands, no scent of mother skin in early morning light. Her mother had been a myth wrapped in silence. Her father had erased her. "Why did he keep me?" she asked at last. The woman poured the powdered bark into the jar, resealed it, and answered without turning. "Because you were valuable," she said, "and because he feared what you might become." The bond stirred again, hotter this time, as if Kale's absence had finally grown too long to ignore. The woman felt it too. "Your wolf is waking," she said. "Soon it will speak." Varya's hands curled slightly at her sides. "And what will it say?" The woman looked up. "That depends," she said, "on whether you listen." There was no invitation to stay, no promise of more. But Varya knew she would return. This place, the woman, the scent, the knowledge buried beneath the dust, was older than her father's rules, older than Kale's silence, older than the fortress itself. She left without another word. Outside, the halls felt different, the cold less cruel, the walls less watchful, and far above, though the sky remained still, she caught the scent on the air. Rain, not here yet, but coming. Chapter 7. Lyra awakens. The storm broke in the middle of the night, not with thunder or wind, but with a silence so sudden it woke her. Varya sat upright in the bed she had finally surrendered to, breath caught in her throat. The room lit faintly by moonlight, pressing pale through the high window. No sound reached her, not footsteps, not voices, not even the familiar hum of the fire. Just silence, so pure it felt like the fortress itself had stopped breathing. Her skin prickled and there was no fear, no reason. And yet her senses flared like a warning had been spoken without sound. Her hands, resting lightly in her lap, curled without thinking. Her spine pulled straighter, every hair on her arms lifted. Then came the voice, not from the door, not from the hall, not from anywhere outside her skin, and it came from within. "You finally heard me." The words were soft. Not human, not entirely formed, but clear enough to slice through the fog behind her ribs. She froze, not out of terror, but because something inside her had broken open, without pain, without violence, and now bled light through every part of her. Her wolf, not a ghost, not a myth, not a hunger to be tamed, but a presence. Female, feral, patient, as if she had been waiting in a locked room inside Varya's bones all this time, silent and still, watching through her eyes, sleeping beneath her skin. She did not speak again. Not yet. But Varya could feel her now. not just as a pulse or instinct or nameless pull, but clearly. Her breath was her own, but her chest rose heavier now. Her limbs were still but charged. Her thoughts were full but edged with something that did not belong solely to her. She stood slowly, barefoot, robe loose, hair tangled from sleep. The air tasted of stone and cold metal, and yet her blood hummed with warmth. She crossed the room in near darkness, reached for the latch on the narrow window, opened it. The cold slapped her skin like a ritual. She welcomed it. The moon sat low, swollen with light, not yet full, but close. The scent of rain still lingered, faint now, replaced by the sharper notes of pine and snow and something more distant. Wolf. Not nearby, not threatening, just present, like her senses had extended farther than the fortress walls without her willing them to. She whispered nothing, she didn't need to. The voice inside her had gone quiet again, not absent. Just watching. Just settling. Not everything needed words. She closed the window slowly and turned, unsure of why she expected anything different in the room behind her. But something was different. The fire had relit itself. Not roaring, not fresh. Just a quiet, low burn in the hearth she had not touched. It cracked once, low and soft, as if acknowledging her presence, then returned to its silence. She didn't question it. There was no reason to. Something had shifted, not in the world, in her, not the moment she stepped into the fortress and not the moment Kale had touched her. Not even the moment the bond had burned beneath her skin. This was the moment her wolf had stirred, and now there would be no going back. The next morning came without warning. The moonlight faded without color, and the sun never quite appeared. But the air warmed slightly, and the silence lifted. Footsteps returned to the corridors. Voices murmured again behind closed doors. The fortress resumed its rhythm. She dressed before the maid could arrive, ate the bread and broth left for her without thought, walked the halls with a new awareness, not in her posture, but in her breath. The guards still did not speak to her, but they looked longer now, not with judgment, with recognition. She passed through the library again, fingertips brushing familiar spines. She found the narrow courtyard with the dead trees and stood beneath them for a long time, face tilted toward a sky she could not see. Her wolf did not speak again that day, but she didn't need her to. She could feel her, like a second skin worn beneath her own, like wind caught in bone, like the memory of something wild that had never forgotten its name. And later, much later, when the evening had quieted and the fire in her room began to burn low once more, the door opened. Kale. He did not enter fully. He stood in the frame, one hand braced against the stone, eyes unreadable, posture calm. She turned toward him slowly. He looked at her the way he had not since the night he took her. Not with calculation, not with silence, but with something deeper, like he knew. And she knew he knew. He said nothing. She didn't offer words either. Because they were past the need for introductions. The bond between them didn't pull or burn or snap. It breathed. It filled the space like heat from the fire, rising slowly, surrounding them. Her wolf stirred again, just once, a flicker of presence beneath her skin. She did not move toward him, and he did not cross the threshold. He turned and left, quiet as ever, but the air in the room remained full long after he'd gone. Chapter 8. The King's Restraint. The fortress held its breath that night. Varya felt it in the way the torches burned lower than usual, the flames flickering without sound, casting long shadows across the stone like stretched, silent hands. The air had thickened, not with storm, not with fear. Something else. A tension that belonged not to the mountain, but to the blood within it. She couldn't sleep. Not because of restlessness, but because her body no longer understood stillness. Her bones ached with energy. Her wolf lingered near the surface now, just beneath the skin, not speaking, but waiting. Every breath felt fuller, every movement more measured, as if something inside her was preparing. Preparing for what she didn't know. But the feeling wouldn't leave her. She paced the length of her chamber slowly, barefoot, hands loose at her sides. The robe she wore was soft, heavier than before, dark enough to melt into shadow. The wind outside had died. Even the trees beyond the cliffs had stopped whispering. When the knock came, it was not loud, not hesitant, and just deliberate. A single sound. She didn't ask who it was, she didn't need to. When she opened the door, Cale stood there. Not armored, not cloaked in formality. Just himself, dressed in black again, the shirt open at the throat, sleeves rolled past his forearms, as if he had left whatever council chamber or war room he'd been buried in without pausing to change. His eyes met hers and held. No command. No apology. No words. Varya stepped aside. He entered without sound, his presence sliding into the room like smoke. He didn't cross to the hearth or the chair or the window. He stood at the center, unmoving, as if unsure why he had come, or perhaps too certain. She closed the door. Her breath moved differently now, shallower, sharper, though she forced it even. He turned toward her then, slowly, eyes catching the low light of the fire behind her. Not hungry, not soft. Fixed. The bond stretched taut between them, the space so thick with tension it could have torn if either of them breathed too deeply. Varya didn't look away. She hadn't seen him like this before, not in posture but in presence. The mask of power he wore so easily, so thoughtlessly, had cracked, just slightly, revealing the weight beneath it. There was something edged in him now, something she recognized because it lived inside her too. Control. And what it cost. She took a single step closer. Not invitation, not surrender, just truth. The scent of him was different this close, earth and clean smoke, steel and rain. Familiar now. Maddeningly so. Her wolf shifted beneath her skin, not forward but outward, pressing against her flesh like it wanted to reach him without her consent. He held still, a statue carved from restraint. Varya raised her hand, slow, deliberate, and let her fingertips hover near his chest. Not touching, not yet. Just close enough that the heat of his body bled into hers, and still he did not move. The bond flickered, then burned, not painful, not soft. Alive. Her breath trembled. Then slowly he raised his hand. His palm hovered above her jaw, a single inch of space between them, a moment suspended in time where instinct demanded closeness, and memory whispered caution. He did not touch her, and she did not close the space. They stood like that, mirroring each other, breath sinking without meaning to, skin alive with sensation neither of them fully understood. Her fingers trembled, not from weakness, but from the magnitude of it. The ache of what existed between them. The terrifying, beautiful, unbearable truth of what they were becoming. Still neither spoke, because there were no words in any language old enough to hold the weight of what pulsed between them now. And then, slowly, he stepped back. Just enough. His hand lowered. Her fingers fell. The moment broke, but only just. He didn't look away from her as he turned to leave. At the door he paused, one hand resting lightly against the frame. And without facing her, he spoke, his voice low, measured, roughened at the edges. You don't know what it would mean if I did. Then he left. The door closed behind him with a sound like breath held too long. She did not cry. She did not collapse, and she stood there. Firelight on her skin, the shape of his presence still in the air around her, and let the silence return. But she knew now, knew it deep, knew it finally, that he was not resisting her. He was resisting himself, and it would not last forever. Chapter 9. The Alpha returns. It began with the scent of ash, not from the hearth which burned low and clean behind her, nor from the mountain wind that swept rarely through the narrow stone corridors. This was older, bitter, burnt earth and the memory of bonfire, a scent she had not breathed in years, but one her body remembered before her mind caught up. Varya paused at the threshold of the corridor, fingers brushing the wall without reason, though it steadied her. Her wolf stirred, not in fear but in warning. There were footsteps ahead, measured, heavy. The kind of walk that announced itself not with sound, but with presence. The guards did not move to stop it. She heard the doors of the lower hall open wide, then close, harder than necessary. A breeze followed, carrying not the cold of snow but the heat of something hostile. Foreign. Familiar. Then came the name, murmured down the corridor by a passing maid, low enough to pretend it hadn't been said at all. Malric, alpha of the Thorncrest pack, her father's chosen buyer. The man who had agreed to take her in exchange for land and silence. The man who had been denied. And he had come here. To claim something, she did not quicken her pace. Did not turn back. But her blood moved differently now, and the echo of her wolf tightened behind her ribs. He had no right to enter this place, and yet he had. Later she would understand what his presence meant, but in that moment, all she understood was the sensation in her skin, tight, alive, bristling with recognition, not the kind that welcomed, the kind that warned. She found Kale in the war chamber. He was alone, standing before a vast map carved directly into the stone wall, his hand resting near the western border where a silver pin marked her father's territory. He did not turn when she entered. He did not ask why she had come. The silence between them had grown heavier over the last days. Not distant, never distant, but layered. Weighted with the things they no longer needed to say aloud. He already knew what she had heard, and still he said nothing. The tension inside her deepened. Not from his silence, but from his control. The same kind of restraint that had filled the space between them that night. The same kind of stillness that did not mean peace. Kale was not calm, and he was contained. The bond hummed. Not the sharp flare it had been in the beginning, but something deeper now, woven, like a second pulse beneath her skin. Varya stood just behind him, saying nothing, waiting. He turned then, finally, slowly. The pale silver of his gaze locked to hers with a weight that held more than words could bear. The heat in the room shifted. He stepped forward once, and something in her moved to meet it before she realized she had. Not in body, in breath, in presence. She held herself still, but the instinct had flared. Her wolf paced now. Awake, aware, no longer content to sleep behind her thoughts. She sent for him, he said at last, voice low and quiet. The meaning didn't strike her immediately. She? Your father's mate, Kale said. The new one. The one who had replaced her mother. The one who had kept to the shadows even when Varya was still a child. She had not thought of the woman in years, had never heard her voice but once. And even then, it had sounded like a hiss through closed doors. Why would she send for Malric, she asked. Kale's jaw shifted, but the answer was already unfolding in her mind. Not to rescue Varya, to remind Kale what had been promised. To leverage the bond that had been bartered behind her back, to force the question of ownership. She stepped closer to the hearth. The warmth did not soothe. It only made her more aware of the heat inside her, one that had nothing to do with fire. Kale's voice came quieter now. He came to negotiate, not for you, for territory. But the message was clear. She didn't ask what it was, because she already knew. Malric had come to make a point that Varya was still in his eyes available, still a deal left unfinished, still a price unpaid, and Kale had allowed him inside. The betrayal wasn't sharp, it was slow, sinking, not because she believed Kale would hand her over. She knew he wouldn't, but because he had invited proximity where there should have been distance. He had let a man who once intended to own her walk into the place she was meant to be safe. She turned toward him, not to accuse, but to see. He was watching her already. Not with guilt, not with apology, but with something harder to read, something that felt like warning. He asked to see you, Kale said. A stillness passed between them. It wasn't a question. And, she said. I said no. No more was spoken. It didn't need to be. But the heat between them shifted again. not desire, not comfort. Alignment. He had not refused out of kindness, or pity, or concern. He had refused because she was his. The room held its silence a moment longer. Then he turned back to the map and she left without another word. Later that night, her dreams did not come gently. She saw the halls burned, the scent of ash rising like a second moon. She saw Malric's face, sharp, smiling, teeth gleaming like wet ivory as he reached toward her with hands already soaked in blood. Her wolf lunged, silent and feral, but the dream never let her catch him. When she woke, sweat clung to her skin. The fire had burned out. She lay still in the dark, breath slow, limbs heavy. The fortress was quiet again. But she knew. This time it would not last. The Alpha had returned, and he was not finished. Chapter 10. Trial by Moonfire. The mountain had its own way of judging things, not with sudden storms or the sharp growl of thunder, but with stillness. A kind of heavy, waiting silence that seeped through the stone and pressed against the bones of every wolf inside it. When the summons came for Varya, it was wordless. A quiet knock at her door. No urgency in the rhythm. Only a single nod from the guard waiting outside, followed by the sharp turn of boots leading her down a corridor she had never been shown before. She didn't ask where they were going. It was already clear from the way the halls narrowed, how the torches burned lower here, more shadow than flame. And the air itself had changed. It carried something metallic and cold, the kind of sharpness that did not come from wind or snow, but from memory, from places where power had been witnessed again and again, leaving the walls steeped in it. They passed no one, no court wolves, no guards, no servants bustling in corners with half-averted eyes. Only the sound of their steps echoing off the carved stone. And somewhere, faintly ahead, the constant sound of water, not flowing, not rushing, dripping. A slow, patient rhythm, like time itself, waiting to be answered. The chamber opened without warning. One moment they walked a narrow path. The next, the stone gave way to a vast, circular room cut directly into the mountain's spine. It was empty of decoration. No banners, no gold, no indulgence. Only the domed ceiling far above, where an opening had been carved through the rock, exposing the night sky in a perfect circle. And through that hollow space, moonlight fell. It was not soft, and it hit the center of the room like a blade, clean and white and cold, casting everything beyond it into half-shadow. There was no warmth in the chamber, only the presence of those who stood in the ring around her, silent, watching, their faces lit only in parts. Elders, warriors, advisors. No expressions, no words, just eyes. And then, behind her, she felt him. Cale had not entered ahead of her nor walked at her side. But he was there now, his presence unmistakable even before the softest click of his boots touched the stone. He said nothing, didn't move forward. But she didn't need to see him to know his gaze had settled on her. He had brought her here for a reason, not to humiliate, not to test, but to reveal. At the center of the chamber, she stopped when her steps met the edge of the moonlight. She could have stood in its shadow just a pace away. She could have stayed veiled, hidden from the weight of those gazes. Instead, she stepped forward, letting the pale light strike across her chest and shoulders, and lifted her chin. No chains held her, no guards flanked her. She was not a prisoner here, but she was not yet free either. An elder's voice broke the silence. It came from her left, an older male, his face weathered like bark, eyes pale with age, but his voice carried the depth of someone who had spoken before kings long dead. Varya of Dral, do you stand for the blood that bore you? The question was ancient, ritualistic, more than just words. It was an invocation of lineage, a call to loyalty, and also a test. For a long moment she didn't answer. Not because she didn't know, but because her answer would become a mark. Once spoken in this room, in this light, there would be no retreat from it. She inhaled slowly. Her voice when it came was clear but low, untouched by trembling. No. A pause followed. Not shock, not silence even. A shift. quiet, barely audible, like wolves adjusting their weight in the dark. The elder did not respond with judgment, only the next question. Then whose blood do you carry? Varya turned her head slightly, not toward Kyle, but toward the moonlight that cut through the chamber. It glowed against her skin with a strange sharpness, cold and clean, like it recognized something in her even if she had not named it herself. I carry my mother's name, she said, the words forming before she'd fully realized she meant them. And I carry the truth she died for. Another murmur moved through the ring. She had never said her name aloud before, not her mother's name, not in full, not before others. It had always felt like a secret, too dangerous to keep, and too sacred to release. But here, beneath the moon, something inside her had shifted. A second elder, a woman this time, stepped forward. Her eyes bore a faint sheen of silver, and her hair, braided tightly down her back, revealed the edge of a scar crossing her scalp. She didn't ask the next question as a ritual. She asked it like she already knew the answer. Do you know what burns in you? Varya's breath caught, but not from surprise, and because she did. She had felt it in her bones since the night she was taken, and more clearly in the days that followed. In every moment Kale passed near her, in every flicker of heat beneath her skin, in the shape her wolf had begun to take. I know, she said quietly. The elder studied her, then gave a slow nod. Not approval, but acceptance. Behind her, Kale hadn't moved, but something in the air around him had thickened. The bond between them, always a hum, always quiet, pressed harder now, not demanding, but undeniable. He had not claimed her yet, had not marked her. But she stood in his circle, beneath his moon. And there was no mistaking what she was to him. Not anymore. Another voice joined, this one younger but not soft. She has the mark of the first. The words dropped like stone into water. Several heads turned, not toward Varya, but toward the one who had spoken. Revka. The old midwife stood at the chamber's edge, her voice carrying without effort. Her eyes locked to Varya, and for the first time her expression softened with something close to pride. She was born under a rare moon, Revka said, and her mother's line traces back to the first Luna Queen. She is not only his mate, she is meant to lead. No one laughed, no one spoke against her, because none could. Bloodlines could be hidden, but the bond could not, and it burned now. Open, quiet, slow, but certain. Kale stepped forward at last. He did not speak, and he didn't need to. He came to stand beside her, only barely within the reach of the moonlight. And in that moment, no one questioned what she was anymore. Not taken, not traded, not bound in silence. She was chosen. The trial did not end with a proclamation. There was no call of innocence or guilt, no crown placed. But as the wolves began to leave the chamber, as the last voices fell into quiet murmurs, the truth had already been spoken. She would not kneel to the blood that had betrayed her. She had stepped into the moonlight and been seen, and from that night forward, no one in Kyle's court would ever again call her pawn. Chapter 11. What the Blood Remembers. There was no sleep that night. The chamber was dark, the hearth burned low, and the mountain air had sunk colder into the stones, as if the trial beneath the moon had left something open that could not be closed. Varya lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling above her, where moonlight slipped through the narrow window in a silver thread. The quiet in her chest was not peace. It was attention. Every breath she took felt watched from within. Her wolf had grown still again, not absent, just listening. It wasn't fear that kept her awake. It was something deeper, the feeling that something had shifted, permanently, not in the way the court saw her. That had changed, yes, but it was more than that. Her body no longer felt entirely her own. Not in the way she once understood. It was stronger now, aware in places she had never known how to feel. Her instincts moved faster. Her hearing stretched farther, and beneath it all pulsed the steady thrum of something waiting. Not dormant, awakening. By morning she rose early, the silence heavy on her shoulders. She dressed plainly. She had no intention of being seen, no courtly audience to face, no guards trailing her steps. She needed distance, not from Cale, but from the way the world had started to press itself around her. The weight of expectation always came after a crown was glimpsed, even if it had not yet been placed. She walked without direction, letting her steps guide her deeper into the older parts of the fortress, the places built into the raw mountain, where the walls had never been carved smooth and the ceilings hung low with age. Few came here. These were corridors meant for things forgotten, not paraded. It was there she found the door. Or perhaps it found her. It stood half-concealed behind a tangle of old tapestries. No markings, no crest, no guards. The wood was aged to near black, the handle tarnished and cool beneath her hand. She paused only once, hand resting against it, her pulse steady. Then she opened it and stepped through. The air inside was different, warmer than it should have been, filled with the dry perfume of herbs, parchment, and old smoke. Shelves lined the walls, not with books, but scrolls, carefully bound and stacked in uneven towers. A fire glowed low in a small stone hearth, and seated before it, hunched over a wide basin filled with something black and swirling, was Revka. The old woman did not look up. "You came," she said simply. Varya stepped closer. "You knew I would." "I knew you had questions. Whether you had the courage to ask them, I did not know." Revka's voice had changed. It no longer held the dry humor she had used in whispers. It was cleaner now, clearer, stripped of any pretense. She spoke as one who had waited a long time to be heard. Varya moved to the basin, her eyes catching the way the black liquid shifted without being stirred. "What is it?" "Memory," Revka replied. "Blood remembers things the mind forgets." She dipped her fingers into the bowl and the liquid shimmered, deepening in color, then slowly forming into patterns, lines, curves, symbols, not written, but lived. It wasn't just vision. It was sensation. Varya didn't understand how she knew that, but she did. Revka withdrew her hand, then gestured for Varya to sit. "Touch it." Varya hesitated, not out of fear but reverence, then she knelt slowly, fingertips brushing the surface. The room vanished, not fully, but enough. The fire became distant. The cold beneath her knees disappeared. She could no longer feel the weight of her robe, the chill in her hair, the light from the hearth. All that remained was heat. Not physical and inherited. Flashes. A woman in a white robe, her face shadowed, standing in a circle of stone, the same moonlight pouring down. A child born beneath a red-stained sky. Hands, dozens of them, marked with the same sigil, pressed to the earth in supplication. A howl rising not from pain but from purpose, and then most sharply, Cale's voice, not speaking her name but calling to her. Not across distance, across time. She pulled back sharply. The room returned at once. Her chest was tight, breath dragging in with too much effort. Her eyes burned. Her skin was warm, too warm. Revka was watching her carefully. "What was that?" Varya asked, her voice low, hoarse. "What's inside you," the old woman said. "What your blood carries. What the others have long forgotten." Varya sat back, her hands in her lap. "You said my mother's line traced back to the first. I didn't understand what that meant." "You do now," Revka replied. "Not with your mind, but with your wolf." There was no flattery in her tone, no awe, just certainty. "The first Luna was not just a queen," she went on. "She was balance, the other half of the first Lycan. She did not rule from behind him. She ruled with him. They were not separate. They were the pack itself." "And I," Varya said, hesitant. "I'm supposed to be that again?" Revka's expression didn't change. "You are what has not happened in 100 generations, a Luna by bond and blood. You weren't brought here to be tamed, Varya. You were brought here to wake." The word landed like a strike, not cruel but sharp. Varya didn't speak, she couldn't. There was too much pressing behind her ribs. Too many thoughts collapsing into sensation. Revka leaned forward slightly. "You're not finished yet," she said. "You're only just beginning. The wolf inside you will come forward when it's ready. And when it does, it will not ask your permission." She rose slowly, crossing to the shelves, pulling down an old scroll bound with leather string. "Take this, read it in silence. Do not show it to Kyle, not yet." Varya accepted it without question. She didn't need to ask what it contained. She already knew it would confirm what had been stirring inside her from the first moment she looked him in the eyes. She left the chamber with the scroll held close beneath her cloak. The corridors had darkened while she'd been gone, though no torches had been dimmed. The shadows felt deeper now. Not threatening, but responsive. As though the mountain itself had seen her differently after what she touched. Back in her chamber, she lit no fire. She sat in silence, and scroll still unopened, and let the quiet settle around her. She had always believed she would have to fight to become something. She had never imagined that becoming would feel like being remembered. Chapter 12. Malric's ultimatum. The days that followed were measured by quiet eyes and unspoken things. No proclamations were made. No court announcements, no names written into history, no symbols pinned to robes. And yet the shift had already begun. It lived in the way the guard stiffened a little less when Varya passed. In how the council wolves bowed, not deeply, but noticeably. In the subtle narrowing of eyes from those who had watched her once as an intruder, and now struggled to define what she was becoming. The trial beneath the moon had not declared her queen, but it had done something older. It had introduced her, not as a possession and as a presence. Still, Kale said nothing. She had not seen him since that night in the moon chamber, not up close. She had glimpsed him across the great hall during council, felt the way the air shifted when he entered a room, noticed the way his wolves straightened around him like gravity had just returned. But he hadn't spoken to her, hadn't summoned her, hadn't sent so much as a word to her chamber. And yet, she felt him everywhere. The bond didn't weaken in his absence, it grew. Quietly. Patiently. Stretching through space like a thread she could never quite loosen from her skin. At night she lay still in the dark and felt the heat of it moving through her. Not a blaze, not yet, but a kind of steady ember that refused to die. Her wolf had grown quiet again, but it watched. It remembered. And Varya had begun to understand that this silence between her and Kyle wasn't distance, it was restraint. It was mid-morning when the silence broke. She had been walking the south corridor alone, the one lined with narrow windows facing the far valley. The wind there always smelled of pine bark and cold iron, clean and sharp enough to anchor her thoughts. She liked that path. No one lingered there. Except today. 2 guards met her near the end of the hall. She recognized one, the younger of Kale's personal sentries, lean and always too still. They bowed, not deeply. "The king requests your presence." The phrasing was polite. But there was a tightness in the way the words were spoken, not from fear, from urgency. She followed them in silence, no explanation, no questions. But the route was enough to tell her what waited at the end of it. They weren't taking her to the council chamber or the library. They led her through the northern corridor, past the arched inner gates that rarely opened, to the fortress's old receiving hall, a room reserved for only one kind of visitor. An audience. Malric was already there when she entered. He stood near the tall windows flanked by 2 of his wolves, the kind bred for brutality more than rank. Their leathers were scorched in places, thick with soot and travel-worn, and their eyes followed her like hounds waiting for a command. Malric had not changed much. His hair was darker now, cropped closer to his skull, and the lines around his mouth had deepened. But his posture was the same. Loose, confident, tilted slightly forward like he was always on the edge of invading the space in front of him. His smile, when he turned to see her, was slow and practiced, and behind it lived something she had once tried to forget. He said nothing, just watched. Kale stood at the far end of the room, near the steps that rose to the high seat. He wasn't seated. He never sat when wolves like Malric were in the room. His expression was unreadable, but his stance was not casual. He had one hand resting on the carved railing beside him, the other at his side, still, but not relaxed. There was no throne in use. This wasn't a court, and this was a standoff. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Malric moved, not toward Kale, toward her. He didn't touch her. That would have been too crude. But he stepped just close enough that the air changed between them, and she could smell the faint trace of cinders clinging to his skin. "I wondered if you'd still be here," he said, voice low, almost conversational. She didn't answer. Not out of fear, because answering would acknowledge the assumption in his words, that she belonged in the space he still imagined for her, that she was something he had once been promised. Malric turned his head slightly, studying her face the way a man studies a blade, admiring the curve, guessing the weight. "You've grown into it, haven't you?" he mused aloud. "That edge. Your father didn't know what he was giving away." Still she didn't speak, and behind her silence she felt Kyle's presence shift, still across the room, but watching every breath. Malric stepped back a pace, then turned toward the king. "I came with a message," he said, his tone sharpening. "Your claim on her isn't sealed, not by mark, not by law. Her bloodline still carries ties to mine." Kyle didn't flinch. "Speak carefully." It was not a threat, just a fact. And in that voice, Malric stilled, only slightly, but enough to reveal the crack in his stance. Varya moved then, not toward either of them, but to the center of the room. She let her steps echo, slow and deliberate, and when she turned to face them both, the light from the windows struck across her shoulders like armor. "You came to bargain," she said finally, her voice low and sure. "But I'm not a weight to measure, and I'm not yours to name." Malric's mouth twitched. "You were promised." "I was sold," she replied, cutting through his words like frost. "And that deal was broken, by fate, not politics." Kale hadn't moved, but his gaze had settled deeper now, anchored not on Malric but on her. Malric exhaled slowly, dragging his stare from her to the king once more. "You'll bring war," he said flatly, "if you keep her." Kyle's voice, when it came, was quieter than before. Colder. "Then bring it." The silence that followed was absolute. Malric didn't answer. He only turned, gave a sharp signal to his wolves, and left without ceremony. The hall remained still long after the echo of boots faded down the stone steps. Varya didn't move, and Kyle didn't approach her. The bond between them was silent, not dulled, but restrained, like both of them had pressed it inward for the sake of surviving the moment. She could feel it burning, quiet and relentless, where it lived beneath her skin. Not yet sealed, not yet spoken, but every wolf in the room had felt it. And so had Malric. Chapter 13. Wolf to Wolf. The forest came without warning. One moment there was stone beneath her boots, the fortress walls shadowed behind her, and the next the scent of pine and moss soaked the air, so rich it clung to her breath. The sky above was slate, streaked with the last light of the sun slipping behind the mountains, and the trees stood tall and silent, dark columns rising from the frozen earth. No wind, no birds, just the thick, breathing quiet of a place older than war. She had not expected to be taken outside the walls. No one had explained. No servant had fetched her. There had only been the quiet knock at her chamber, and the single word the guard spoke. "Come." She followed without asking. There was a stillness to Kale when he waited at the courtyard gate, something unreadable behind his posture. He didn't meet her eyes when she approached, nor offer explanation. He simply turned, and she followed him into the forest. It had been hours now, or maybe less. Time bent differently in places like this, untouched, wild, sacred in a way she didn't yet understand. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them had grown a language of its own. Every step that carried her deeper into the trees beside him made the air change around her, made her breathing slow, her pulse sharpen. She hadn't felt her wolf so clearly in days, not since the trial, not since the scroll, not since the dream that left her spine burning with memory. But now she felt Lyra again, pacing just behind her thoughts, not speaking, not restless, just present, watching, alert. Kale stopped ahead of her in a clearing where the snow had melted in a wide circle around the roots of an ancient tree, its bark split and furrowed with age. The light caught the silver of his eyes when he finally turned to face her, not with question or command, but with something heavier. Expectation. Permission. She didn't ask what this was. She understood. This was not about war or court or bloodlines. This was something older, something primal. This was the place where wolves remembered what they were. Kale stepped back once, then once more. And as he did, the shift came. Not slowly, not with drama or ceremony. One breath, and he was there. And then he wasn't. Where he had stood now stood a wolf, massive, taller than any she had seen, coat black with streaks of gray along his back and neck, the shape of power made flesh, not wild, not savage, controlled, still. Varric. She didn't need the name spoken to know it. She felt it. The weight of him pressed against her senses like cold iron against skin. His eyes, those same silver eyes, met hers and did not waver. He did not bare teeth. He did not lower his head. This was not dominance, this was invitation. Her breath shook once, then steadied. She had never shifted with another present. Her wolf had never come fully to the surface since childhood, held back by silence, fear, and a father who had trained her to fear power more than anything else. But now she felt Lyra pressing forward, not with force, but with hunger, as though she had waited too long and would not wait anymore. Varya stepped back once, then twice. Her body knew what to do before her mind caught up. The pain came as it always did, not sharp but stretching. Her spine bent, skin pulling tight, breath stolen from her lungs in a rush of heat and cold and flame. And then it was over. Lyra stood in her place, and her coat was ash gray with a silver wash across her back and legs, her build lean but not delicate. Her eyes a stormed silver, matching his in shade, but not in shape. Varric watched her. Lyra watched him, and in that gaze, something passed. They circled each other in the clearing, slow, precise, not touching, not speaking, learning. Varya could feel it now more clearly than anything she'd ever known. His presence in her body, not inside her thoughts but beside them, brushing against her like a hand skimming water. She didn't hear his voice, not yet, but she felt the pull, the bond, wolf to wolf. He moved first, a single step, a tilt of the head, a low sound, not a growl, not a command. A greeting. Lyra responded without words, dipping her head slightly, circling closer. Their fur brushed. The contact was brief, but it sent something sharp through her, like static, like heat, like truth. Her wolf didn't recoil. She pressed forward, not submission, acknowledgement. They moved in slow arcs, the air between them thickening with shared instinct. She caught the scent of his breath, the way the snow steamed beneath his paws, the tension in his stance. He was powerful, but he did not use it against her. And she, who had always been told she was small, fragile, a piece to be passed, stood with him now as something equal. Lyra didn't whimper. She didn't lower her head. She stood tall. And Varric accepted her. Their movements grew quicker, still careful but more fluid. They ran, once, a single burst of speed through the trees. Nothing chased, nothing hunted. Just the movement itself, the feel of the forest under paw, the rhythm of a body no longer restrained. Her wolf rejoiced. When they returned to the clearing, they stood still in the melt ring beneath the ancient tree, their breath curling in twin streams. Varya felt the shift before it began. Not forced, not summoned, just natural. And then she stood again in her human form, skin flushed, breath uneven, hair clinging to her neck. Kyle stood across from her, already returned to himself, his chest rising slowly, eyes fixed on hers. Neither of them spoke. There were no words large enough for what had just happened. Not touching, not claiming, not marking. But something had happened here. Something sacred. He crossed the clearing toward her. Not hurried, not slow. He stopped when only a breath of space remained between them. She didn't look away, and when he reached for her not to take but to touch, his fingers grazed her jaw, as though he were learning the shape of her for the first time. She closed her eyes, not because she was afraid, but because her body remembered what the blood had only just begun to understand. This was not the end of something, and it was the beginning of the burn. Chapter 14. Walls begin to fall. The forest did not return to silence after they left it. It followed Varya back into the stone halls of the fortress, clinging to her skin and scent like a memory that refused to settle. Something had shifted beneath the trees, not just in her body, but in the quiet space between hers and Cale's. There had been no words in the clearing, no promises made, no vows spoken, but their wolves had touched, had seen one another, had moved together through instinct and breath, and now the silence they returned to was no longer empty. It was full. She felt it most in the way the fortress breathed differently around her now. The walls did not press the same way. The corridors no longer watched. Even the servants who moved past her in the hallways seemed to hesitate longer, as if unsure whether they should bow deeper, speak softer. Something unspoken had changed. She didn't speak of it. Not to anyone, not to herself, and instead she walked the paths of the stronghold like a shadow reborn. The wolf inside her no longer waited. It prowled. Quietly. Constantly. Not angry. Not anxious. Just awake. She had not shifted again since the forest. There had been no need. Lyra had left a mark, not on the earth, but in her blood. Her instincts were sharper. Her control had narrowed to a point. Every sound, every scent, every movement was clearer now. She no longer felt like something incomplete. But Cale had not called for her. Not for 3 days. She had seen him from a distance during a war council when his voice echoed across the vaulted chamber with the weight of command, and again in the east wing when the quartermasters brought forward the latest reports of pack movements. He had looked at her both times, once directly, but no words passed between them, no gestures, nothing spoken aloud. And yet the bond did not fade. It was stronger now than it had ever been, and subtler. Not a pull, not a heat, but a presence, heavy and constant, threading through her every breath. She could sense when he was near long before she saw him, the scent of storm-soaked earth, of metal cooled too quickly. It settled into her skin like a second heartbeat. She did not chase it, but neither did she run from it. On the 4th night, sleep came late. She lay in her chamber, still dressed, the robe loose around her shoulders, the fire flickering low at the hearth, and the scroll from Revka still unread beside her. She had touched it once. She had not unrolled it. Not yet. Instead, she closed her eyes to the sound of wind beyond the narrow window, not loud, but constant, like breath being dragged through trees without end. Her body ached, but not from pain. From containment. There were parts of her now that refused to go still. She had only just begun to drift when the knock came. Not loud, not insistent. A sound like an afterthought. But her eyes opened at once. She did not speak. She rose slowly, barefoot against stone, and opened the door. Kyle stood there. He said nothing, he didn't need to. His presence filled the doorway like it had been standing there for longer than time would admit. He looked different tonight. Not in dress, his clothes were as they always were, dark and plain. But his posture carried something quieter, something looser at the edges. There was no armor in the way he looked at her. No mask. She stepped aside. He entered without hesitation. The chamber was warm, but it did not soften the silence. It stretched between them as Kyle crossed to the fire and stood there, hands clasped behind his back. He did not sit. He did not ask if he could stay. He simply stood in her presence, as though whatever had pulled him here did not require permission. Varya watched him without speaking. She waited, and at last, after a silence long enough to hold the weight of days, he turned to her. His voice came low, controlled. "I didn't bring you here to make you less." The words landed with more weight than she expected. They didn't rise from apology. They came from somewhere older. She didn't answer. Not yet. Kyle's gaze did not waver. "You were meant to rise. I knew it the moment I saw you." He paused, then added, "And I knew it would cost me." Varya moved to the edge of the firelight. She didn't cross to him. She didn't touch him. "I was afraid of what rising would mean," she said quietly. "What I'd lose if I did." "You've lost nothing," he replied, but she shook her head. "No. I've lost the illusion that I could ever belong to myself alone." There was no anger in her voice. Only honesty. Kale stepped forward, slow, deliberate, and the bond between them pulled tighter. Not searing, not aggressive. Just closer. It moved beneath her skin, like a breath caught between two lungs. He reached for her, one hand raised but still halfway between them, waiting. Not taking, not demanding, and this time she didn't hesitate. She closed the space, not fully, not recklessly, just enough to feel the heat of him through the air. His hand met her waist, slow and light, resting there as if he needed to prove he could touch her without claiming her. Her breath caught, not in shock but in recognition. They were no longer testing each other. They were circling something inevitable. When his hand lifted again, his fingertips brushed the side of her throat, slow, measured, reverent, not possessive, not hungry, just real. She leaned into the touch barely, and then nothing more. He stepped back. She let him. Because this wasn't the moment. But it was the beginning of the moment. Kale turned once, glancing at the unlit corner of the room, then back to her, as if memorizing the shape of her there in the firelight. His voice came softer now, quieter than she'd ever heard it. "You remember what you were," he said. "Now you must decide what you will become." Then he left. The door closed with a click, and Varya stood in the stillness, eyes fixed on the place he'd been. The bond pulsed once, not urgent, but waiting. Chapter 15. Tied without touch. The next morning unfolded without urgency, but nothing about it felt still. A hush had settled over the fortress. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that followed movement not yet explained. Couriers passed through the halls more quickly. Beta Thorn was seen stalking the eastern wing with his voice lowered and his shoulders taut. Council members remained cloistered behind closed doors, emerging only briefly before vanishing again like ghosts who had not finished haunting. Varya watched from the shadows of the upper gallery, unseen but not unaware. She could read the unease in the way people moved, the way their eyes flicked to doorways and stairwells before committing to a path. No one said it aloud, but the weight of war had begun to press more fully into the stone walls. Malric's threat had not been made for theater. It had been a test, and Kale had not blinked. He had done worse. He had dared to leave it unanswered. No declaration, no retaliation, no show of brute power to settle the matter. Just a stare, and a single sentence that promised nothing except the confidence to wait. And now the wolves waited with him. But not all of them waited quietly. A message had arrived that morning, sealed in black wax and carried not by a soldier but by a merchant, an old trick, intended to suggest peace. Varya had not seen the letter, but she'd heard enough from the whispers trailing behind the council doors. Malric had named a date, not for war, for negotiation. An insult veiled in civility, a demand masked as a courtesy. And Kale, it seemed, had accepted. Varya left the gallery without a word. She needed air, not just from the politics of wolves, but from the ever-thickening tension she carried within her. Since the forest, since the moment her wolf had run beside his, something inside her had not rested. She carried the bond like a second skin now, not burning, not pushing, but present. A silent tether wrapped around her ribs, pulling not forward, but inward. She had not spoken to him since the night he came to her chambers and left her with more quiet than answers. But he was near. Always near. She felt him before she saw him. Outside, the air had sharpened, laced with the brittle cold that came just before frost. The wind moved in short gusts through the stone courtyard, lifting the scent of pine from the forest beyond. She stepped out into it slowly, letting the cold bite against her skin, not as punishment, but as clarity. The world always smelled cleaner in the morning, sharper edges, fewer masks. She crossed the outer steps, boots silent against the flagstones, cloak pulled tight against the wind. He stood near the far wall, one hand braced against the stone, the other loosely at his side. His back was to her, but she didn't need to see his face. The curve of his spine, the stillness in his shoulders. She knew that silence. Not calm. Contained. The same restraint he had worn since the first time they touched and did not give in. She didn't call out to him. She crossed the courtyard and stood beside him, close enough to share the breath of cold between them, far enough that no one watching from the windows above would see it as anything more than an exchange of words. He didn't speak, but he shifted slightly enough to let her know he had felt her come. They stood that way for a long time. She looked ahead, not at him, eyes tracing the tree line far beyond the gates where the fog still clung low to the ground. Beyond that, the edge of Malric's lands. Beyond that, the boundary of what she used to call her father's reach. She thought of all the things that had been taken from her without ever being named. Her voice, her choice, her wolf, her bloodline, her future. And then, slowly, she looked at him. Cale did not move. But he spoke. When I first took you, I told myself it was strategy. His voice was low, not for secrecy, but because it could not be louder. I told myself you were leverage, that you were just his daughter, just a weight to be moved. He turned to her then slowly, and the full weight of his eyes met hers. But I knew the moment I touched you, he said, that none of that was true. She didn't answer. Her body already had. She stepped forward, closing the space between them, not with urgency, but with precision, as if every inch of distance meant something, and she was measuring each one against the truth of what she'd become. His hand lifted again like it had before. This time she met it with her own. Their fingers brushed, not clasped, just touched, and the bond lit. Not like fire, like breath held too long, suddenly exhaled. Her wolf stirred behind her ribs, not with hunger but with recognition. And for the first time, she felt his presence in her blood, as if he'd been standing behind her all along, just out of reach. Not claiming, not forcing. Waiting. Cale's jaw shifted, the tension in his body still visible in the line of his shoulders. She could see how carefully he held himself, as if letting go would mean unraveling more than either of them could rebuild. But he didn't step back and he didn't retreat, and neither did she. There were no words to be spoken here. The closeness said enough, not passion, not submission, not yet. Only this. We are tied, even when we do not touch. The wind moved between them once, brushing hair against her cheek. She closed her eyes briefly, felt the air shift with his breath. He let go first, not of her hand, of the restraint. For a single heartbeat she saw it in his eyes, the truth, and then, as always, he stepped back, and the moment ended without a sound. Chapter 16. The first blow. It began with smoke. Not the kind that rises from hearths or warms the bones of a mountain-bound fortress, but the kind that rides the wind long before fire is ever seen. Bitter, acrid, sharp with resin, and something worse. Fur, maybe. Blood. The scent arrived hours before the messenger, curling in tendrils down from the high peaks, threading itself through the inner corridors, until even the walls seemed to breathe differently. By the time Varya reached the war chamber, the mood had already turned. No shouts echoed, no panicked orders flew across the room. The wolves gathered around the long black stone table were quiet, precise, their movements sharpened by the presence of something real. Not politics, not strategy, something simpler. Loss. Kyle stood at the far end, not flanked by guards or courtiers, but alone, His hands braced flat against the map spread before him. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow and the muscles along his forearms were tense enough to show the truth. He had not moved since the smoke had been confirmed. No one looked at her when she entered, and no one needed to. They had all heard the same report. Malric's wolves had struck, not at the fortress, not at the crown, but at the edge of Kyle's outermost village, a stretch of land known more for its wheat than its warriors. It had no strategic value, no defenses. It had been marked only by its loyalty to the Lycan King. And now it had been razed. 3 buildings gone, 2 livestock pens burned, 1 child missing. Not war. Not siege. A message. Varya did not ask permission to approach. She crossed the chamber until the scent of smoke was no longer imagined but clinging to the seams of Kale's tunic, the fabric dusted faintly with soot at the shoulder. He had already gone there, already seen it. He did not look at her, and he didn't need to. She stood beside him in silence, her presence sliding into place like a second blade being drawn beside the first. She didn't reach for the map. She didn't speak the names of the lost. There were no words that could stand beside smoke. One of the council wolves spoke from across the room, voice flat with restraint. The fires were set from within, doors broken, not burned. It wasn't a warning, it was an insult. Another finished. Kale's hands flexed once against the stone. The wolves fell silent again. Varya's eyes drifted to the map. The village had been marked with only a small sigil, 3 lines, joined at the base. She had seen it before. A farming hold. One of the few territories where pups still played outside without a watch. It was not a battlefield, but it had been made one. She inhaled through her nose, slowly letting the scent of ash ground her. She remembered her father teaching her, long ago, that war never arrived with fanfare. It began quietly, with fire, with the absence of something that had always been there, with silence that came too late. Kyle straightened at last, his fingers curled into fists before releasing again. He didn't speak to the table. He didn't issue commands. He turned toward her, his eyes not cold but iron, tempered by something hotter beneath. "You're not going with me." It was not an offer, not a debate. It was protection, spoken in the language of kings. And she did not argue. Because she knew that protecting her wasn't about her. It was about the control he still thought he needed to hold. And she knew, too, that he was wrong. She inclined her head, only slightly. Then she turned and left without a word. In the corridors outside, the tension pressed deeper. Footsteps moved faster now. Packs gathered in corners, low murmurs curling behind stone pillars like smoke itself. Swords were being sharpened, not for parade, but for purpose. The fortress had awakened, and with it something inside Varya stirred too. Not grief, not fear. Resolve. She didn't return to her chamber, and instead she found the lower hall, the one with the iron doors and the long, dusted corridor beyond it, where the warbound kept their armor. No one stopped her. The guards at the entrance saw her, recognized her, and stepped aside. Inside, she did not touch the weapons, not yet. She walked until the room opened wider, until the shelves grew higher, until the scent of old steel gave way to something older. Fur, dried blood, oil, sweat, and silence. The training hall. It was empty now. The warriors were above, preparing for departure. But the fire still burned low in the wall, and the racks of blades gleamed faintly in the torchlight. She stepped into the center of the room and closed her eyes. Her wolf did not speak, but she felt her. She could feel every part of her body more clearly now. Each pulse of breath, each stretch of muscle, each sliver of thought sharpened by instinct. And beneath it all, the bond. Still there, still burning. She turned toward the door, knowing he would not come back before nightfall, knowing he would not leave her unguarded, even if he thought she didn't see it. But something had changed. Kale had crossed into war, and she, who had once been a gift passed like coin, who had been raised to sit quietly while others sharpened blades, stood in the heart of the Lycan King stronghold and remembered the truth. She had never belonged to peace, and she had only been waiting for a fire to answer. Chapter 17. The Queen Without a Crown. Night pressed down like a second sky. Within the walls of the mountain fortress, the torches burned lower than usual, their flames dancing thin and pale against the stone, casting long shadows that flickered across high arches and silent corridors. The scent of iron clung faintly to the air, not fresh blood, not battle, but steel unsheathed and waiting. Cale was gone. He had left before sunset, leading a forward unit down through the valley and across the Stone River Pass. Not an army, just enough wolves to remind Malric what the word king meant when spoken aloud. He'd left without a final word, without a glance behind him, but Varya had felt it as clearly as if he had placed a hand over her heart. He was giving her space, or he was giving himself time. Either way, the bond had not weakened in his absence. If anything, it pulsed stronger, like a tether drawn tauter with every mile between them. He was not suppressing it anymore. He couldn't. It was threaded too deeply now. But it was not Cale's absence that filled the hallways with silence. It was her presence. In the hour since his departure, the fortress had begun to tilt toward her, slowly and without announcement. Doors that had once stayed closed now opened. Wolves who once avoided her gaze now paused, nodded, waited for her to speak. They didn't call her Luna, not yet, but they no longer looked confused about where she stood. She had stopped standing in the shadows, and now she moved as though the air itself answered to her. Varya passed through the inner gallery with measured steps, her cloak brushing lightly over the stone floor, the weight of her wolf curled steady beneath her ribs. Lyra didn't speak. She didn't need to. They were no longer two separate things battling for space. They had begun to align, one breath, one spine, one mind that thought in teeth and memory. Revka found her near the library. The old healer didn't speak at first. She merely fell into step beside her, her pace slow but deliberate, her scent still heavy with herbs and ash. Her hands were stained faintly green from something crushed fresh in the apothecary, and yet her eyes, sharp, silver-rimmed, always watching, carried none of the weariness of age. "You feel it now?" she said without preamble. Varya didn't answer. "Good," Revka added after a moment. "It means you're ready." "Ready for what?" Varya asked quietly. Revka stopped walking, turned, met her gaze head-on. "Legacy," she said simply. "It's not something you wear. It's something you survive." Varya held her stare, and she thought of the fire, the ash, the sound of Cale's voice when he said, "You're not going with me." She thought of the empty village, of a child's name lost before it could be carried home. And she thought, too, of the quiet way the fortress had started to bend, not toward a throne, but toward her spine. "What happens if he doesn't come back?" she asked. Revka gave no comfort. "Then you rise faster." The rest of the night passed in watchfulness. She walked the upper halls once, then again. She didn't sleep, she didn't sit. The moon rose behind high stone, filtered through narrow windows, casting pale lines across the floors like runes too old to read. The guards rotated, no one spoke, no one questioned. And still she moved. The second hour before dawn came quietly. The air cooled more than it had all night, and the silence shifted. Not with threat, with attention. Something had changed. She felt it first in her pulse, an echo. Not fear, not pain, Cale. The bond surged, sharp and sudden, not with alarm but with proximity. He was near, too near for someone who had ridden half the night. She moved before her thoughts caught up, slipping through the inner gate, down the spiral steps toward the lower courtyard, the wind rising around her like a summons. He emerged from the trees beyond the outer wall, no torch to mark his return. The guard at the post called no warning. There was no need. His form moved with purpose, black cloak sweeping low, jaw tight, eyes unreadable in the half-light. But she knew something had happened. There was blood on his sleeve, not his own from the scent and smoke in the edge of his hair. Not an injury. A message returned. He saw her as he passed the last gate. Stopped. Neither of them spoke. The distance between them was fewer than 10 paces, but the bond made it feel like breath against skin. She took one step forward, not toward him, but toward the truth. "You sent them running," she said softly. Kyle's eyes flicked once toward the stone behind her, toward the fortress that now carried her scent as surely as his. They needed a reminder. And did they listen? He looked at her then, not with the cold of a king, but with the fire of a wolf who had chosen not just a mate, but a war. "They heard me," he said. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was full. She didn't ask what it had cost, he didn't explain what he had done. The understanding between them had begun to outgrow words, but she saw something new in his eyes. Not caution, not restraint. Permission. He would not mark her yet, would not claim her under a roof that had once seen her taken, but the walls of the fortress no longer held her back. They had already begun to bend to her shape. And when the dawn came, she stood at the highest balcony, cloak pulled tight against the wind, the last ash of war still clinging faintly to the edges of her scent. The queen was not crowned, but the realm had started to kneel. Chapter 18. What Cannot Be Undone. The morning after the retaliation burned too quiet, not peaceful, not still, just waiting. The kind of quiet that settled deep into the walls of the fortress like breath held between heartbeats. The air carried a metallic edge, subtle and sharp, like a blade freshly drawn and set on a table. It wasn't over. Not yet. Malric had lost men, but not pride. And pride always bled slower than flesh. Varya woke before the sun crested the peaks. Sleep had come thin and restless, more sensation than rest, her limbs aching with energy that had nowhere to go. Her dreams had been full of ash and smoke and Kyle's voice. Not calling, just existing, steady and low. The sound of something tethered too tightly to be ignored. When she opened her eyes, the bond pulsed low in her chest. Not painful, but present, reminding her that she hadn't been alone even in sleep. She rose slowly, dressing without thought, her movements efficient, deliberate. The robe she chose was deep charcoal, almost black, the fabric heavy at the hem. It wasn't ceremonial, it wasn't pretty, but it bore the weight of someone who would no longer be mistaken for passing through. When she stepped into the corridor, the guards stationed outside her door straightened, neither startled nor stiff, but subtly aware. One stepped aside before she could speak, and she realized then that she no longer needed to explain where she was going. The stronghold had begun to adapt to her without instruction. She moved through the halls with purpose, not toward the council chambers or the training courts, but downward, into the old heart of the fortress, where the stones grew darker and the torches burned lower. Few ever ventured there without order. Fewer still lingered. But she was not looking for counsel. She was looking for truth. The chamber was hidden behind 2 locked doors, both of which opened under her touch without resistance. No guards, no resistance, only shadow, and the hum of something ancient behind the stone. The room was narrow and long, its walls carved with patterns too old to be called language. In the center stood a single stone basin, its surface still. The scent was familiar now. Herbs, smoke, and the faintest trace of blood. It hadn't been used since the night Revka summoned memory from her blood, and yet the air still thrummed with what had been stirred there. She approached in silence, and there was no ritual, no chant, only her presence. When she touched the water, it didn't flash or boil. It simply deepened, darkening until her reflection vanished and something else rose in its place. Not a vision, a memory, and not hers and her mother's. The image came in pieces, a woman with silver in her hair, kneeling at a stone altar, a child wrapped in linen, placed gently in the arms of a second figure, bigger, shadowed, eyes sharp with something unspoken. Then the voice, soft and low, not speaking to the child but over her. A vow, not to protect, to hide, to keep her away from what was coming. Then darkness. The water cleared and Varya stepped back, Her breath came low, her heart steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, from knowing. They had hidden her. Not from enemies, but from fate. And Cale had not just claimed her as punishment. He had found what others had buried. The wolf within her had never been weak, only waiting. She didn't linger. By the time she reached the main hall again, the wind had risen through the windows, carrying frost on its breath. Her hands still bore the chill of memory, but her spine was straight, her jaw set. She knew now what had been taken from her, and what had been returned without asking. Cale stood at the edge of the war room, speaking low to Thorn and two of the northern scouts. His back was to her, but the moment she entered, he turned. The bond snapped tight and not painful, certain. He crossed to her without hesitation. The others fell silent. Not dismissed, eclipsed. She met him halfway, and still they did not touch. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. She saw it in his eyes that something had shifted in him too. The anger that had carved itself into his expression the night before had cooled, but it hadn't left. It had settled deeper now, forged into something quieter. Resolve. But more than that, understanding. He saw her. Not just the woman who had defied him, not the daughter of a traitor, not a pawn he'd once taken for vengeance. He saw what she had become. Varya stepped closer, not to offer herself, not to provoke him, but because this was where she belonged now, not at the edge of the war, but at its center. He said her name softly just once, and she nodded. And in that moment, something passed between them that could not be undone. No claim had been made, no mark, but the choice had been. Later, when the halls quieted again, she stood alone at the high window that overlooked the eastern valley, the last light catching in her hair. She felt the weight of the fortress behind her, the pulse of wolves moving below, the steady burn of Cale's presence in the back of her mind like a drumbeat. The war would come again, it always did, but for the first time she would not meet it from behind another's shadow. She would meet it as herself. Chapter 19. The moment between. The fortress did not sleep the night before the full moon. No horns were sounded, no alarm struck, but the change was there, just beneath the surface, woven into the cadence of footsteps, the tightening of guard rotations, the hushed instructions that passed through the halls, like secrets no one dared speak aloud. War had not yet arrived at the gates, but it had begun its slow spiral inward, and the walls knew it. Varya did not leave her rooms after nightfall, not from fear, from knowing. She stood before the fire with her sleeves pushed back to her elbows, her hair loose and unbound, her skin still carrying the faint scent of iron and pine from the hours spent in the inner training courts. She had not trained with a blade, not today. Today had not been about weapons. Today had been about control, not over others, over herself. There were fewer hours between her and the claiming than she cared to count. She could feel it now, not just as heat beneath her skin, but as stillness. A quiet so deep it echoed inside her chest. Her wolf had stopped pacing, not out of rest, out of readiness. Lyra was waiting, and so was he. The knock came just after moonrise. One sound, low and deliberate. No urgency, no hesitation. She turned toward the door, already knowing. Kyle stepped inside without ceremony. He wore no crown, no cloak, only a dark shirt that fit close to his frame, and trousers tucked into worn boots still dusted faintly with ash. He looked not like a king, not like a warrior, but like a man, walking into the place he had fought his whole life not to need. And yet here he stood. She didn't speak, and neither did he. He closed the door behind him without taking his eyes from her. The silence that stretched between them was not uncomfortable. It was dense. The kind of silence that had been earned, carefully, painfully, over months of restraint and undoing. When he crossed to her, it was without pretense, no slow stalking, no posturing, no distance. He stopped only when there was nothing left between them. She could feel the bond now like pressure in her blood. Not burning, not aching, just there, alive and humming, ready to break the last thread of resistance between them. Cale lifted one hand not to pull her close, but to let his fingers rest just at the edge of her jaw, the pad of his thumb brushing the place where her throat met her collarbone. Not possessive, not claiming, just learning her. She closed her eyes not to escape the moment, but to feel it. He had touched her before, briefly, carefully, but never like this. Never without armor between them. Never without the mask. Now there was nothing but the truth. She didn't need to ask if he felt it too. The bond sang in the space between their skin. Her breath came slower, steadier, not because she wasn't afraid, but because the fear no longer felt like a threat. It felt like change. When his other hand slid to her waist, there was no hesitation, no testing. He already knew she would not pull away. He leaned in, slow and deliberate, his lips brushing the side of her neck, just below the place where the mark would go. He didn't bite. Not yet. He only pressed his mouth to the skin there as if giving her one last chance to run. She didn't. She tilted her chin back and stepped closer until the last space between them vanished. The heat rose steadily, not sudden, not savage, but like something long denied finding its shape. Her wolf surged, but did not break. His presence settled against hers like a second heart beating in time with her own. And still he waited. His voice, when it came, was low and quiet, barely a breath against her skin. "I will only take what you give." She opened her eyes. The answer had been written across every decision she had made since the day he took her. Every defiance, every silence, every time she stood in his presence without shrinking. She was not giving herself, and she was meeting him. Varya brought her hands to his chest, her fingers splaying over the slow, steady rhythm of his heart. She leaned into him, her body fitting to his as though it had always known where to go. And she whispered only one word. Yes. The mark came not with pain but with clarity. A sharp, brief pressure, then heat not burning but blinding. Her body arched into his, not from shock but from completion, and the bond snapped into place like the last breath of a vow being spoken through flesh. Her wolf howled, not aloud but inside her, a sound that tore through every boundary she had ever been taught to fear. And she felt his answer, not in sound, in fire, in silence, in the truth that they were now one. When it was over, they stood still, their breathing quiet, their foreheads resting together in the hush that followed the storm. Kyle's hand cupped the back of her neck, fingers woven into her hair. Varya's palm remained over his heart, and neither of them said what came next. They didn't need to. The war would come, and the crown would wait. But the bond had been sealed, and the queen had chosen. Chapter 20. Crowned in Flame. The night of the ceremony arrived beneath a sky too clear to be real. No clouds, no wind. Only the weightless hush of stars burning bright above the peaks, their light scattering across the cliffs like embers thrown from a fire too ancient to name. The moon hung low and full, silver and solemn, not soft, not for them, but vast. Watching. The fortress had been transformed. Not with flowers, not with banners, but with fire. Tall braziers lined the high stairs, their flames rising like golden spears into the air, smoke curling toward the heavens without hurry. The great hall had been cleared, the stone floor washed and dusted, the carved pillars dressed in black silk and silver thread. No guests from outside the realm had been invited. This was not a celebration. It was a coronation, and coronations required only one thing: recognition. Cale stood at the far end of the chamber, flanked by no guards, no council. He wore black, no medal, no jewels, no crown. The only adornment was the mark at his throat, faintly visible beneath the open collar of his tunic. A half-healed wound, silver-edged, fresh, eternal. He had been marked in return. Varya stepped into the hall from the western doors. No fanfare greeted her, no trumpet, no call, only silence. But as she moved through the wide chamber, every wolf lining the walls dropped their gaze. Not in submission, in reverence. She wore no veil, no tiara. Only a long, Obsidian-colored gown cut with clean lines and silver threading along the wrists and throat, the fabric flowing like water as she walked. Her hair had been pulled back simply, braided at the sides and left to fall loose down her back, revealing the mark just below her collarbone. Still red, still pulsing faintly, still warm to the touch. The air shifted as she crossed the room as she felt it, the pull of him, not the bond, him. Cale's presence drew her like gravity, like blood to fire, like breath to wind. There was no music, no voice calling her forward, and still, her steps did not falter. She did not look at the wolves watching her. She didn't need to. They had seen the shift. They had felt it. The power in the air no longer came from only one throne. It moved now in 2 heartbeats. When she reached him, Cale extended his hand. Not a command, a choice. She placed her fingers in his without hesitation. The hall remained silent, and then slowly, he turned toward the waiting steps. Together they climbed. 3 steps and no more. At the top stood a stone pedestal, low and wide, carved with the ancient runes of the old kings. No crown rested on it, no robes, only fire, low, flickering flame held in a wide silver basin. He turned to her. The bond stirred. It did not burn now. It breathed. Cale raised her hand to his lips and pressed a single kiss to her knuckles. No one gasped. No one moved. This was not performance. This was right. He stepped back 1 pace and bowed. The Lycan King, Alpha of Alphas, Warden of the Realm, bowed before her, not because she asked, but because he knew. She was no longer his prisoner, no longer his leverage, no longer the daughter of a traitor. She was his match. And his queen, she stepped forward alone, lifted her hand, and placed her palm over the flame. The fire did not burn. It surged. Gold light flashed up her arm, licked across her collarbone, and vanished into her skin like it had never been separate from her at all. A collective breath moved through the hall, not noise, not awe. Recognition. The Luna had risen, not by blood, by fire. She turned back to him, the firelight still flickering in her eyes, and he reached for her again, hand steady, eyes darker than she had ever seen them. When their palms met, the bond between them throbbed with a pulse so deep she felt her knees weaken, not from fear, from surrender, to fate, to him, to herself. He pulled her into his arms, not urgently, not carefully, but completely. As if she had been made to be there. As if everything that came before had only ever been shadow. She leaned into him, and when his mouth found hers, there was no heat, no hunger, no battle, only truth. The kiss was slow, endless, final. Not the end of their story, but the end of resistance. When they pulled apart, the fire behind them roared once, high and loud, a sound like mountains breathing, and the wolves below bowed their heads, not out of command, out of instinct, because they had felt it too. The realm no longer belonged to just one, it belonged to them. The king and his Luna, crowned not by gold, but by the fire that never lied.